When people talk about divine justice, they often describe it as perfect, flawless, beyond human comprehension. Yet the stories told about it look very human, very flawed, and at times disturbingly cruel. If a parent punished their child with unending torment for disobedience, no one would hesitate to call it abuse. But when the same is attributed to a deity, it's rebranded as holy wrath or righteous anger. The question is often brushed aside: does this God actually take pleasure in punishment? If wrath is part of his nature, if vengeance is described as his, then we're left asking whether suffering itself is somehow woven into the divine plan. Religious texts don't just present wrath as a reaction, they elevate it, give it a place of honor, almost as though pain is a kind of offering. That raises a disturbing possibility that suffering is not only allowed, but cherished. Consider how many times in Scripture punishment is not portrayed as reluctant but celebratory. Floods that wipe out populations, fire from the sky raining down on cities, plagues meant to terrify. These are not accidents. They are showcased as demonstrations of divine power. What's more unsettling is the framing, the idea that people must witness this destruction not only as a warning, but as proof of the deity's strength. It reads less like justice and more like a performance. In human terms, when someone finds satisfaction in the pain of others, we call it cruelty. Yet in theology, cruelty gets rebranded as justice because it comes from above. The same act, if done by a human leader, would be called tyrannical. But in religion, it becomes sacred law. That double standard is striking, and it reveals how much people are willing to excuse when it's wrapped in divine language. Psychologically, punishment that is endless or disproportionate does not correct behavior. It destroys. Studies on deterrence consistently show that severity of punishment is far less effective than certainty and fairness. If infinite torment awaits for finite mistakes, the logic breaks down entirely. No court system would be allowed to operate under those principles, and yet countless people are told to accept this system as the most just of all. The concept of wrath also creates a cycle of fear that benefits religious institutions. If people believe that a God burns with anger at them, they are more willing to submit, to donate, to obey authority figures who claim to speak on his behalf. Fear becomes a tool of control. Not only fear of punishment in this life, but fear of a punishment stretched into eternity, a punishment so absolute that no human mind can truly grasp it. The troubling part is how much joy is sometimes associated with this punishment. Throughout history, there are sermons where preachers describe the damned writhing in hell while the saved look on in delight. The idea that bliss in heaven is somehow enhanced by knowing others suffer, that's not just disturbing, it's psychologically revealing. It shows how religion can condition people to accept ideas they would otherwise find abhorrent. Think about how this framing has been used politically. Leaders invoking divine wrath to justify wars, crusades, inquisitions. If suffering is not only deserved but celebrated, then cruelty can be carried out with a clean conscience. The burning of heretics, the torture of so-called witches, the slaughter of entire villages, all explained as God's judgment, not human cruelty. That's the terrifying efficiency of religious wrath. It launders violence, making it appear holy. Sociologists often note that systems built on fear and punishment tend to stagnate. They enforce obedience, yes, but at the cost of growth, creativity, and moral reflection. When people live in constant fear of divine anger, they're less likely to question authority or explore alternative ideas. They adapt not by becoming more compassionate or wise, but by becoming more submissive. Fear produces conformity, not morality. And what about children? From a young age, many are taught that disobedience can lead not just to parental anger, but to divine wrath. Nightmares of eternal fire are planted in the minds of kids barely old enough to understand right and wrong. That shaping of a child's psychology leaves scars. Studies on religious trauma show how deep the fear runs, with adults decades later still haunted by the thought of punishment that never ends. The question lingers: if love was the goal, why was fear the primary method? The strange paradox is that believers often describe God as incapable of experiencing petty emotions like jealousy or spite, yet wrath is described as a central part of his character. It's not just reactive. It's depicted as righteous fury. That word righteous is important. It suggests that anger is not only justified but admirable. But if wrath is admirable, then cruelty becomes a model to emulate. Look at how often believers justify cruelty against others by pointing to God's example. From harsh parenting methods to draconian laws, the idea is that if divine wrath is good, then human wrath modeled after it must also be good. This is how entire cultures normalize punishment, even celebrate it. In some cases, parents are encouraged to hit their children because Scripture says God disciplines those he loves. The cycle of fear and pain continues. What gets ignored is the possibility that punishment without empathy doesn't elevate. It degrades. A system that thrives on wrath cannot nurture compassion. If God truly found no pleasure in suffering, then punishment would look different. It would aim at restoration, growth, and healing. Instead, what we often see in theology is punishment that has no end, no redemptive arc, no possibility of repair. That's not justice, that's vengeance. The more we examine it, the clearer it becomes that wrath functions less as an expression of divine perfection and more as a projection of human anger. People create gods in their own image. And when those people are vengeful, their gods are too. Ancient societies were filled with harsh rulers who ruled by fear, and their gods mirrored that dynamic. The divine wrath wasn't heavenly at all. It was political, social, deeply human. And yet, people still cling to it, perhaps because fear is a powerful motivator. It keeps communities together, ensures loyalty, and discourages rebellion. A God who smiles only when you obey and scowls when you falter is a perfect reflection of authoritarian power structures. To call this love stretches the meaning of the word beyond recognition. This raises the central question again. If punishment is inevitable and eternal, if wrath is constant and celebrated, does God take pleasure in our suffering? If the answer is yes, then we're left with a deity who is cruel. If the answer is no, then we must face the contradiction in the scriptures and teachings that repeatedly glorify his anger. Either way, the concept does not hold up under scrutiny. The image of wrathful judgment has always been a powerful tool, but it also reveals a contradiction that's hard to ignore. If God's wrath is infinite, then so is his displeasure. And if his displeasure is infinite, then nothing humans can do could ever truly satisfy him. That creates an endless loop where punishment isn't the exception, it's the norm. Think of how this reshapes morality. Instead of asking what makes an action compassionate, fair, or beneficial to others, the central question becomes, will this provoke divine anger? In other words, morality gets reduced to fear management. You're not encouraged to cultivate empathy. You're encouraged to avoid punishment. That's a very different foundation for ethics, and one that often produces guilt and shame rather than genuine moral growth. History shows us the consequences of this mindset. Entire societies have punished dissenters, not because the act was harmful, but because they feared divine wrath if they allowed it. Blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, public executions, all justified by the claim that tolerating such behavior would anger God. But if God's anger is eternal and unchanging, how fragile is his perfection? What kind of being requires constant appeasement, like a ruler who lashes out if the crowd doesn't cheer loudly enough? This pattern shows up even in smaller, everyday practices, people praying not out of gratitude, but out of fear of neglecting God, people avoiding questions, suppressing doubts, not because the answers don't matter, but because they're terrified of provoking wrath. This creates communities where curiosity is treated like rebellion, and conformity is rewarded, even if it means silencing your own mind. Theologians sometimes argue that God's wrath is really just another expression of love, that punishment proves care. But if that logic were applied in human relationships, we'd reject it instantly. If a partner abused someone and called it love, we'd call it toxic. If a government tortured citizens and claimed it was for their own good, we'd call it tyranny. And yet, when a deity does it, it somehow escapes moral critique. That inconsistency should trouble anyone who values fairness. It's also worth noting that wrath-based systems rely on punishment as spectacle. Punishment has to be visible, talked about, shared in stories. That's why religious texts don't simply say wrongdoers were corrected. They say entire cities were annihilated or generations wiped out. Punishment isn't just about correction. It's about making a statement. But when the statement overshadows the supposed lesson, punishment becomes an end in itself. Even modern preachers often speak with a kind of intensity when they describe God's wrath. You can hear the shift in their tone, their voices rise, their faces flush, their energy grows. They speak of eternal fire with a conviction that borders on excitement. It's as if the wrath itself is a source of emotional power for them. Which raises another unsettling question. Do humans, consciously or not, take pleasure in the idea of others being punished because they believe their God does too? This is where psychology offers some clarity. The concept of moral outrage has been studied extensively. People often feel satisfaction when wrongdoers are punished, even if the punishment doesn't repair the harm. That's a human trait. It makes sense in small tribal groups where reputation mattered, but scaling that up into theology creates a distorted picture of justice. Instead of repair, it becomes about vengeance. Instead of growth, it becomes about submission. And here's the real problem. When people internalize the idea that wrath is sacred, they become more comfortable with cruelty in their own lives. Harsh discipline feels justified. Exclusion of outsiders feels righteous. Violence feels necessary. The theology of wrath doesn't just remain in books. It seeps into the way people treat each other. Now think about how wrath-based teaching collides with modern values. Today, we know more about psychology, trauma, and recovery than ever before. We understand that punishment without compassion often creates cycles of harm. We know that fear-driven environments suppress individuality and creativity. And yet, religion still clings to this ancient model of divine wrath as if it were timeless wisdom rather than a relic of a brutal past. That disconnect is especially stark in the age of science and reason. We can now ask, if an all-powerful God truly exists, why would he choose wrath as his defining feature of justice? Why would he need plagues, floods, eternal torment, when he could simply create understanding, empathy, and growth? Why choose fear when he could choose love without conditions? Unless, of course, wrath isn't divine at all, but human anger projected onto the cosmos. Wrath also serves a strange narrative role in religious stories. It creates tension, fear, and drama, which can be more captivating than quiet kindness. Think of how audiences react to tales of disaster, war, or destruction. There's an intensity there that calm, everyday goodness doesn't deliver. So, wrath becomes not just a theological claim, but a storytelling device. It hooks people in with the spectacle of divine rage, but if that's the case, then we're forced to ask whether wrath is being used more for dramatic effect than for moral teaching. A God who consistently chooses spectacle over substance looks more like a character written for impact than a being embodying ultimate justice. And the danger is, people begin to live their lives according to that drama. They see the world as a stage where punishment is always lurking just off screen. This worldview leads to another paradox. If wrath is the defining proof of God's power, then compassion becomes secondary. People are told that love is central, but the stories they hear, the sermons they absorb, emphasize punishment far more often. Fear becomes the first language, and love is tacked on as an afterthought. That imbalance reveals what truly drives the system. Control through fear. There's also a social dimension worth exploring. Anthropologists point out that in ancient times, when societies were struggling to survive, fear of wrathful gods helped enforce order. In small, fragile communities, the threat of divine punishment kept people from breaking rules. But as societies grew more complex, that same fear was weaponized by leaders. Kings, priests, and emperors could claim divine backing for their authority, warning people that disobedience wasn't just rebellion against rulers, but against God himself. Wrath, once a mythic explanation for natural disasters, became a political tool, and that legacy lingers. When politicians today talk about disasters as acts of God or frame tragedies as punishments for societal sins, they're tapping into that same old idea. The belief that suffering proves wrath still shapes how people interpret the world, but this explanation falls apart under scrutiny. Natural disasters follow geological and meteorological patterns, not moral ones. Yet the narrative of wrath persists because it offers a simple, if brutal, way of making sense of chaos. There's something deeply unsettling about the comfort some take in believing disasters are punishment. It means that instead of helping victims, people sometimes stand back, convinced the suffering was deserved. After earthquakes, floods, or pandemics, religious voices have claimed it was divine anger aimed at specific groups. The cruelty of that idea is obvious, and people already in pain are labeled as deserving of it. But it also shows how belief in divine wrath can short-circuit compassion. Consider, too, how wrath is often linked with eternal punishment. Hell is the ultimate expression of divine anger, endless, absolute, without reprieve. If such a system were truly just, it would raise serious questions about proportionality. No finite mistake could warrant infinite torment. Yet the concept survives because it creates maximum fear. Fear strong enough to override doubts, fear strong enough to shape behavior for a lifetime. Psychologically, this plays into something called terror management theory. Humans know they are mortal, and that knowledge can create deep anxiety. Belief systems that offer eternal reward or eternal punishment tap directly into that fear of death. Wrath becomes the stick, paradise becomes the carrot. It's a dual mechanism to ensure compliance. But the darker side is that wrath looms larger because fear is often more motivating than hope. This raises another important point. If punishment is the centerpiece, then free will is compromised. If the cost of making the wrong choice is infinite pain, then the choice is not truly free. And it's like being told you can do as you please, but if you make one wrong step, you'll be burned alive forever. That's not freedom. That's coercion. A system based on wrath disguises itself as offering choice, but in reality, it strips choice away. The human consequences of this worldview can't be overlooked. People raised in environments dominated by wrath-based theology often carry deep-seated guilt and fear long into adulthood. They may feel haunted by mistakes, convinced that some cosmic punishment awaits them. Religious trauma therapists frequently describe patients who panic at the thought of death, not because of death itself, but because of the threat of eternal wrath they were taught as children. That's not moral guidance. That's psychological harm. And yet, wrath is still preached as though it is good news, as though the existence of punishment proves the existence of justice, but justice without mercy, without proportionality, without the possibility of growth or redemption, ceases to be justice at all. It becomes nothing more than domination. A God who finds satisfaction in endless punishment is not delivering justice, and he's delivering cruelty cloaked in authority. Wrath also reshapes how communities view outsiders. If punishment is sacred, then those who suffer must be guilty. Outsiders, heretics, unbelievers, their misfortune becomes proof of their corruption. This mindset feeds prejudice, discrimination, and even violence. Instead of empathy, people are encouraged to see suffering as deserved, a sign that divine justice is already at work. You can see this logic in history. When plague swept through Europe, entire groups were blamed. Jews, foreigners, women accused of witchcraft. The belief was that God's wrath had been provoked and someone had to pay. Instead of directing anger at disease or poverty, people targeted minorities. That cycle of scapegoating reveals how easily divine wrath becomes a justification for cruelty. The same thinking echoes today when religious leaders blame natural disasters on social changes they disapprove of. They insist hurricanes or earthquakes happened because of laws passed, lifestyles chosen, or beliefs tolerated. It's a way of turning tragedy into a sermon, of converting human suffering into moral theater. But underneath it all is the disturbing assumption that God's wrath is not only real, but selective, targeting some while sparing others. That randomness, far from proving justice, only makes the system look arbitrary. This brings us back to the question of whether God takes pleasure in punishment. Because if wrath is delivered in ways that don't correct behavior, don't prevent future harm, and don't show consistency, then what's left? The only conclusion is that wrath exists for its own sake and that suffering is somehow satisfying to the divine. Otherwise, why would it continue endlessly? There's another angle that often gets overlooked. The way wrath is tied to spectacle of loyalty. Many religions teach that one day the faithful will witness the punishment of the unfaithful. The image of the saved looking down upon the damned has been painted, preached, and sung about for centuries. But if eternal bliss is enhanced by watching others suffer, what does that say about the morality being promoted? It implies that joy is incomplete without comparison, without someone else's pain to highlight your reward. That's not compassion. That's Schadenfreude elevated to theology. Think about how damaging this is psychologically. If people internalize the idea that watching others suffer is not only acceptable but sacred, it changes how they view empathy. Instead of seeing suffering as a call to help, they see it as confirmation of justice. That mindset hardens hearts, dulls compassion, and encourages detachment from the pain of others. And yet, many still defend this system by saying wrath is necessary for balance, that punishment proves holiness. But in human societies, justice isn't defined by how much pain is inflicted. It's defined by fairness, restoration, and the ability to move forward. A justice system that only punishes with no chance for growth is one we'd reject instantly. So why accept it from a deity? The truth is, wrath-centered theology doesn't elevate morality. It infantilizes it. It reduces humans to fearful children, constantly worried about provoking punishment. Growth, curiosity, and exploration are stifled under the weight of fear. People end up obeying rules not because they understand them, but because they dread the consequences of disobedience. That's not wisdom, that's control. And here's the contradiction that many overlook. If God is perfect, then his happiness cannot depend on punishment. Perfection, by definition, lacks need. So why would such a being require anger, vengeance, or endless displays of wrath? The more you think about it, the more wrath looks like a projection of human psychology, specifically the psychology of power. Rulers of old demanded fear, demanded obedience, and their gods mirrored that. Wrath was less about divine reality and more about human control. When you strip away the layers, wrath reveals itself not as an eternal truth, but as a cultural tool, a way to keep people in line, to make sense of disasters, to enforce authority. But once you see that, the question shifts. The issue is no longer about whether God takes pleasure in punishment. It's about why humans invented a God who does. One reason humans may have invented a wrathful God is because fear works. Societies have long known that fear is one of the strongest motivators. It overrides hesitation, it demands obedience, it silences dissent. If leaders wanted loyalty, a God who punishes became the ultimate enforcement. People may doubt the king, but who dares doubt the heavens? Wrath was not only believable, it was useful. And when you look closely, wrath aligns neatly with power hierarchies. In ancient kingdoms, subjects were expected to revere their rulers, to tremble at their anger, to see punishment as deserved. Those same qualities were then ascribed to God. It's no coincidence that divine wrath mirrors royal wrath. Both serve the same function, to maintain authority through fear. But over time, this fear doesn't only bind communities, it also breaks people from within. When someone is taught that the greatest power in existence delights in punishment, their relationship with themselves becomes distorted. Mistakes feel unforgivable. Doubt feels dangerous. Even normal human emotions like anger or desire feel like invitations for divine rage. The inner world becomes a battlefield where guilt and fear never rest. That's why so many people who leave wrath-centered religions describe an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time, they no longer feel like they're living under constant surveillance by a cosmic punisher. They describe freedom not as license to do whatever they want, but as the ability to live without the crushing weight of eternal condemnation. their morality doesn't vanish. It often deepens because it's no longer built on fear, but on empathy and reflection. There's another dimension here that deserves attention. When wrath is preached, it doesn't only shape how believers see themselves, it shapes how they view the future of humanity. If history is seen as moving toward a final act of destruction, where God unleashes ultimate wrath, then the focus shifts away from building a better world. Why work for justice here if everything ends in fire? This kind of apocalyptic thinking has consequences. It discourages progress. It justifies environmental neglect. It feeds fatalism. The promise of wrath at the end of time drains responsibility from the present. And yet, despite all of this, wrath is still defended as proof of love. That contradiction may be the most revealing of all. To say that eternal punishment is love is to twist language beyond recognition. It's to redefine cruelty as care. If someone in everyday life told you they harmed others for their own good, you'd call it abuse. But when a God is described that way, it's presented as sacred truth. That double standard exposes how belief in wrath forces people to suspend their natural moral instincts. Think of how children respond to these teachings. A child who loves their parent naturally trusts them, but when that parent teaches that God is always angry, always watching, ready to punish forever, the child's trust is shaken. Their innocence is clouded by fear. They don't simply learn about right and wrong. They learn that their worth is conditional, fragile, dependent on never-provoking wrath. And for many, those lessons stay with them long into adulthood, shaping their identity and their self-worth. It's striking how unnecessary wrath is when you step back. Humans are capable of moral growth without it. Communities can thrive through cooperation, compassion, and fairness. Societies have built laws and systems of justice that emphasize rehabilitation and restoration over vengeance. We don't need eternal punishment to understand that harming others is wrong. We don't need threats of wrath to feel empathy. Wrath adds nothing essential to morality. It only adds fear. So again, the question remains, if wrath serves no real moral purpose, if it causes harm, if it distorts compassion, why does it persist? The answer may be that wrath has never been about morality at all. It has been about power, control, and fear. And if that's the case, then the disturbing truth is that wrath survives not because it's divine, but because it's effective. It frightens people into compliance. It silences doubt, and it keeps authority unquestioned. So when we ask whether God takes pleasure in our punishment, the answers offered by religion don't really resolve the problem. Some say no, he punishes reluctantly out of necessity, but the stories don't reflect that. Like others say yes, that his glory is magnified by wrath, but that only paints him as cruel. Either way, the logic collapses. What we're really left with is a mirror, a reflection of human fear, human anger, human desire for control. Wrath wasn't born in the heavens. It was born in human societies that depended on fear to survive. And then it was written into Scripture, sanctified, and passed down as truth. But once you see it for what it loses its power. Because the truth is, morality doesn't need wrath to stand. Compassion doesn't need punishment to be real. Empathy doesn't require threats. If anything, wrath corrupts those things, twisting love into fear and justice into vengeance. A world governed by wrath would be a world without growth, without redemption, without freedom. And yet, the world we actually live in shows us the opposite. People grow not through terror, but through connection. Children thrive not under constant threat, but under encouragement and care. Societies advance not by celebrating punishment, but by finding ways to heal and restore. Wrath is not what makes us better. It's what holds us back. So maybe the real revelation is this. If a God truly needed wrath to prove his love, then that love was never real to begin with. And if wrath has been nothing more than a human invention, then letting go of it doesn't mean losing morality. It means reclaiming it. And that realization, more than any threat of punishment or promise of reward, is what frees people to live with clarity, integrity, and compassion. Not because they fear wrath, but because they finally understand they never needed it.